At the end of the 19th century, the world map was dominated by a single empire that stretched across oceans and continents. The British flag flew over ports, railways, mines, and sea routes that connected global trade into one vast system. British warships controlled the seas, moving freely between continents without serious challenge from any rival power. This naval dominance created confidence in London, and confidence slowly turned into complacency. London was not only a capital city, it was the financial heart of the world where governments borrowed and empires depended on credit. Decisions made in quiet offices along the Thames could shape markets and futures thousands of miles away. To British elites, global order felt natural, stable, and permanent. Across the Atlantic Ocean, another nation was finishing a very different journey. The United States had spent decades expanding westward, consuming land, resources, and populations. By the 1890s, the frontier had closed and America's internal conquest was complete. Factories replaced frontiers, and steel mills roared where wilderness once stood. Railways bound cities together, and industrial output surged beyond European expectations. The American population exploded as millions arrived seeking work and opportunity. Despite this growth, European powers still viewed the United States as loud, immature, and unrefined. America was underestimated not because it was weak, but because it had not yet tested its power beyond its shores. That moment was approaching. Far from imperial capitals, deep in northern South America, a border existed mostly on paper. Venezuela and British Guiana were separated by forests, rivers, and swamps that few outsiders had ever explored. The land was dense, humid, and hostile, filled with insects, flooding rivers, and endless jungle. For centuries, this region held no strategic or economic value to European empires. Spanish maps hinted at one boundary, Dutch maps suggested another, and British maps slowly pushed westward. When Britain inherited Guiana from the Dutch, the frontier remained vague and undefined. No formal survey marked where one territory ended and the other began. Venezuela protested quietly, but its voice carried little weight in European diplomacy. The young republic was unstable, weakened by internal conflict and repeated political upheaval. Britain, by contrast, saw no urgency in resolving the question. An empty border created no pressure and demanded no compromise. Diplomats filed reports and postponed decisions year after year. The jungle absorbed the dispute and hid it from the world. For decades, the border problem remained invisible, ignored, and unresolved. But ignored borders have a way of returning. Everything changed when the jungle stopped being worthless. Prospectors discovered gold buried beneath river mud and forest soil in the disputed territory. What had once been ignored suddenly promised wealth beyond imagination. Word of the discovery traveled faster than maps or treaties. Miners arrived by riverboats and footpaths, cutting through jungle to reach the goldfield. Entire camps appeared where only trees had stood before. Rivers, once valued only for navigation, became arteries of profit. British settlers moved in with confidence, backed by imperial authority. London no longer saw empty land. It saw revenue and strategic advantage. New maps were drawn that pushed Britain's claims farther west than ever before. The Orinoco region gained new importance as a gateway to trade and control. Gold transformed geography into politics. For Venezuela, the shift was alarming and immediate. Foreign settlers now occupied land the nation believed was its own. What had been a distant dispute became a direct threat. The jungle was no longer hiding the problem. It was exposing it. Venezuela lacked the power to confront an empire directly. Its military was small, its economy fragile, and its politics unstable. Diplomatic protests sent to London produced no meaningful response. European powers had little interest in challenging Britain over a distant republic. Cut off from allies, Venezuela searched for another path to survival. The answer lay to the north. The United States had declared long ago that Europe should not expand in the Americas. For decades, that declaration had been mostly symbolic. Now Venezuela needed it to become real. A former American diplomat was hired to shape the message. Pamphlets, letters, and articles flooded Washington with a single argument. Britain was not just claiming land, it was testing American authority in the hemisphere. The dispute was reframed as a challenge to American principles. Maps became evidence, and history became a weapon. Lawmakers began to pay attention. A forgotten border issue was turning into a question of power, and Washington was listening. In Washington, the dispute no longer looked distant or abstract. It arrived at a moment of political pressure and public frustration. Economic hardship had left the nation restless and searching for confidence. The presidency faced criticism for weakness and indecision. Standing firm abroad offered a way to regain authority at home. American leaders studied the maps and saw more than a border. They saw a question of influence. If Britain could expand freely in South America, American declarations meant nothing. A principle ignored once would be ignored again. The Monroe Doctrine was no longer history. It was a test. The State Department drafted a response with unusual force. Words were chosen carefully, but their meaning was unmistakable. The message asserted American authority over the hemisphere. It demanded that the dispute be settled under American oversight. For the first time, the United States spoke not as a former colony, but as a power, and the message was sent across the Atlantic. In London, the American message was received without urgency. British leaders viewed it as noise rather than a warning. The empire had faced complaints before and survived them all. To Britain, the Monroe Doctrine was a statement, not a law. It had never been recognized by Europe or enforced by force. The American tone felt bold, but not dangerous. British confidence rested on habit and history. The Royal Navy had no equal, and that fact shaped every assumption. Diplomacy with smaller powers had trained Britain to expect delay, not defiance. Silence became the chosen response. Weeks passed without a formal reply. The lack of acknowledgement was intentional, not accidental. British officials believed the pressure would fade. They assumed Washington was performing for domestic audiences. The empire had misread the moment, and time was quietly running out. In Washington, British silence was not taken lightly. What London saw as patience, America read as contempt. The delay felt deliberate and deeply personal. Political debate turned into national outrage. Newspapers framed the issue as a test of dignity. Public meetings echoed with calls for firmness and resolve. Old memories of imperial arrogance resurfaced. Veterans and politicians spoke of unfinished business. Across party lines, unity formed around confrontation. Military planners quietly examined worst-case scenarios. Shipyards discussed production schedules. Militia units resumed drills in city streets. Confidence grew alongside anger. America was ready to prove it could not be ignored. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was very different. British citizens were confused by the sudden hostility. Few had followed the dispute or cared about its details. Shock replaced indifference as war talk filled headlines. The possibility of conflict was no longer theoretical. The crisis had escaped diplomacy and entered the public mind. Behind closed doors in London, enthusiasm disappeared. Military planners began counting ships, not traditions. The Royal Navy was powerful, but it was spread across the world. War in the Atlantic would expose trade routes elsewhere. Protecting Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean at the same time was impossible. Any concentration of force would leave colonies vulnerable. Canada suddenly became a liability instead of an asset. Its long border offered no natural defense. A land invasion could not be realistically stopped. British industry could not match American output in a prolonged conflict. Factories in the United States could replace losses faster than Britain could endure them. Financial risk proved even more alarming. British investors were deeply tied to American markets. Fear of war triggered panic selling and credit strain. The cost of conflict threatened the empire itself. For the first time, victory no longer seemed guaranteed, and pride was no longer worth the price. As tension peaked, events far from the Americas reshaped British priorities. In southern Africa, a reckless operation collapsed into embarrassment. A British-led raid into Boer territory ended in failure and capture. The humiliation spread quickly through imperial circles. Then came a message that made matters worse. Germany's emperor publicly praised the Boer resistance. The statement was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. It suggested German willingness to challenge Britain directly. Public anger in Britain shifted almost overnight. The focus moved away from America and toward Europe. Germany was rising, ambitious, and dangerously close. Strategists reconsidered the empire's list of enemies. Facing two major powers at once was unthinkable. Choices had to be made quickly. Preserving the empire meant avoiding unnecessary wars. The crisis with the United States now looked optional, and an exit became not only possible, but necessary. British leaders began searching for a way out. Public defiance gave way to private negotiation. Signals were sent quietly across the Atlantic. The tone shifted from dismissal to conciliation. Arbitration emerged as the acceptable solution. It offered retreat without public surrender. Britain agreed to submit the border dispute to neutral judgment. The decision marked a profound reversal. Conditions were added to soften the retreat. Long-established settlers would remain where they lived. Technical details preserved a sense of dignity. In Washington, the response was calm and controlled. Victory had been achieved without firing a shot. The principle mattered more than the territory. Authority had been asserted, the standoff dissolved, and the threat of war faded. The world moved on, but the balance of power had shifted. The resolution did not end with arbitration. It began a quiet transformation in British strategy. London reassessed where its power truly mattered. The Western Hemisphere no longer topped the list. Britain chose accommodation over rivalry. Control of influence became more important than control of territory. One concession followed another. Long-standing agreements were revised without resistance. The United States was granted freedom to shape regional infrastructure. Military presence in the Americas was reduced. Naval forces were recalled to home waters. Caribbean bases lost their strategic importance. Britain no longer planned for conflict with America. Instead, cooperation became the default. A new understanding replaced old competition. The empire had not collapsed, but it had stepped aside. The United States moved quickly into the space that had been cleared. Regional authority shifted from distant empires to a nearby power. Washington redefined stability on its own terms. Intervention replaced restraint. Financial pressure became a preferred tool. Military presence followed when necessary. The hemisphere was reorganized around American priorities. Old European claims were discouraged without open confrontation. New doctrines justified, expanded involvement. The United States presented itself as a guardian of order. Local governments discovered the limits of their independence. Venezuela gained protection but lost autonomy. Economic influence replaced territorial conquest. Resources flowed northward under new arrangements. Power had changed hands without formal annexation. A new order emerged, quietly, and it would shape the next century. No shots were fired and no armies marched, yet a world quietly ended. The crisis passed without a treaty that declared victory or defeat. What changed was understanding. One empire recognized its limits, another discovered its reach. Britain had ruled through habit, tradition, and accumulated authority. America asserted itself through confidence, industry, and resolve. The transfer of power did not come with celebration. It arrived through hesitation and calculation. By stepping back, Britain avoided destruction. By stepping forward, the United States reshaped the hemisphere. The lesson was absorbed by both sides. Strength no longer came only from fleets or flags. It came from economics, production, and political will. Venezuela stood at the center of a struggle it could not control. Saved from one empire, it fell under another. The border in the jungle remains, but its meaning is larger than geography. It marks the moment the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the moment authority crossed an ocean. History remembers wars, but this silence mattered more. The world that followed was built on it.